Welcome to the webinar entitled New Technologies and Approaches to Assess Local Ecosystem Services Towards a Circular Landscape Management. My name is Mark Bellen, and I'm the Director of the Jakarta office of the Royal Netherlands Institute of Southeast Asian and Caribbean Studies and of the Office of Leiden University in Indonesia. I'm joining you from the Netherlands, and I will be your moderator today, with the technical support of my colleagues, Sweta Manggarani and Rosa Damayanti in Jakarta. This is the 10th edition of our Leiden Lecture Series in Indonesia, which this year have all been conducted online because of the COVID pandemic. And this is also the last Leiden Lecture of this year, and notably the one with the longest title. The lecture today will be in English, but you can ask questions in Bahasa Indonesia in the chat box. After the presentations, there will be a Q&A session. Now it is time for me to introduce the speaker of today. Professor Peter van Bodegom is Professor of Environmental Biology at the Institute of Environmental Sciences at Leiden University. With his department of approximately 60 employees, he investigates the mutual dependencies between nature and society. His department addresses urgent challenges in understanding the impact of human influences on nature and biodiversity, and the needs of society for nature through natural capital and ecosystem services. By developing state-of-the-art tools from molecular ecology for environmental DNA, remote sensing in data assimilation systems, and data science for global databases and analysis, e.g. on traits-based approaches or functional diversity patterns, nature and biodiversity patterns are assessed and unprecedented accuracy and resolution. In inter- and transdisciplinary national and international teams, he contributes to the sustainable solution towards creating a resilient livelihood. His focus therein is on quantifying the natural mechanisms involved, the connections to society, and the trade-offs and synergies at the spatio-temporal scales. Through his work, he stimulates creating new visions on our landscape, advising provinces, water boards, national governments, and European organizations. In addition, he's Education Director of the MSc program on Governance of Sustainability, a transdisciplinary program to prepare students to become a change agent to implement sustainability. He's also coordinator of the Greenport Hub of the Leiden Delft Erasmus Center for Sustainability, to stimulate the transition to a circular horticulture and agriculture in the region. Peter has always enjoyed working at the interface of scientific fields. He graduated in soil science at Wageningen University in 1995. In 2000, he received his PhD at Wageningen University, working at the interface of microbiology and plant ecophysiology modeling, with the distinction cum laude. He subsequently worked as a postdoc, tenure tracker, assistant and associate professor at the Department of Systems Ecology of the VU University Amsterdam, connecting ecology to climate and global change modeling. In 2015, he moved to Leiden University to fulfill the current position. Peter has published more than 200 peer-reviewed papers, including publications in leading journals like Nature, PNAS, Nature, Ecology, Evolution, and Ecology Letters, and has been keynote speaker on various conferences. So this was quite an impressive introduction, so just that you know that Peter really knows what he's talking about. And with no further ado, I would like to give the floor to Peter for the webinar today. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here today. Well, normally I really would have liked to sort of join all of you live, well, as we all know, unfortunately, that's not possible. But sort of, I thought this would be at least a virtual token that sort of we are still alive and kicking at Leiden, although we are all facing the same kind of problems probably as you do. So I was just mentioning to Marek that over the past 8 months, my life was an unanticipated major makeover of our teaching program, which kept us busy. So I really appreciate to be here with you today and to be able to give this presentation. So the other apology that I have to make is for the long title. The long title was based on because this is the same title that I've been using for a report for the OECD last month. And my presentation today is based on this report that I wrote for the OECD because they asked me as an expert panel member to help giving them advice how to make a transition towards a circular economy from the standpoint of the OECD. So that's the reason why things were the way they were. I would like to go to my presentation. So indeed, what I would like to do is how can we use ecosystem services as a way to, well, create a more sustainable landscape and create a more sustainable society ultimately. And just to set the scene, sort of this is from the IPBES report, so the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, the United Nations organization that currently evaluates nature and ecosystem services on a global scale. And these are some numbers that come from their global assessment, which indicates that the current state is pretty alarming when we are looking at nature. Throughout the globe, both marine and terrestrial, nature is declining. And this is also something that you can see from sort of kind of an overview. Apologies. So this is an overview of the various ecosystem services that are around, and they made an inventory in the IPBES report for those ecosystem services. And basically all ecosystem services are in decline, with a few exceptions. So why should we care about ecosystem services? Well, the main reason is that we think that ecosystem services do help us to create a better well-being. So thanks to nature, so on the left-hand side of this panel, thanks to nature and kind of what nature does, we benefit as society from nature by creating all kinds of values that help us, well, in our well-being in the long run. So the question is basically, how can we make sure that nature can keep on providing those services to us human beings, such that indeed we have a better well-being? And if you look at it, from my point of view, this is also something that luckily also has become increasingly aware during the corona crisis. So as soon as people were allowed to go outside, these are two pictures from last May, June, out of the Netherlands. Immediately people would go to the small parks inside the city to recreate and to enjoy sort of the green and the nature around them. So this is indicating to me that indeed after being, well, in a lockdown, one of the first things people really want to be at is in nature, even though all of these people are city dwellers, etc. But despite this, being in nature is something that feels as a fundamental kind of thing they are enjoying. So based on that, the whole idea is, or the whole key question to us is, can we use ecosystem services as a way to transform our thinking about nature and therefore protect nature on the one hand, and at the same time making a transition towards a more sustainable or circular society? Before going into those more technical details though, I would like to go with you to a little quiz, and I would like to do so in Mentimeter. So my question to you, and I'm not sure whether you can sort of, if you can go to mentimeter.com, there's a particular code involved in which you can use to answer this particular question. So I basically would like you to know your opinion before we continue, whether you think using ecosystem services is a good thing to preserve nature. And just to set the scene a bit, I gave you three possible answers. One is, well, yes, it does create awareness on the importance of nature. No, we should leave nature alone. Or yes, because decision makers do need arguments in order to, well, argue about their investments, for instance, in nature. And I'm curious to hear your opinions on this. Well, it's quite interesting. So I asked similar questions to some of my students, for instance, in the MSc of Governance and Sustainability that I'm teaching. And usually 50% of those students indicate that we should leave nature alone because, well, ecosystem services is a highly anthropogenic concept. And only looking at sort of what nature does to us as society and not taking the ethical boundaries of nature into account. So sometimes they consider it quite offensive that we are using only the value to us human beings as a argument to protect nature. But apparently sort of you are all convinced that well, nature could be helping, or ecosystem services could be helping us as a way to protect nature. Well, that's interesting. So thank you for that. Then in the remainder of my presentation, I would like you to indicate sort of how can we think about using ecosystem services or nature in general to achieve some of the transitions that we want to achieve. And just one more statement coming from the IPBES report that indicates that at the current rate, we will not be able to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. So based on this inventory, you can see that most of the nature contributions, so the way in which nature can help achieving our Sustainable Development Goals, are all declining. So the way currently we are using nature does not help us to attain our general Sustainable Development Goals. And basically our opinion at the Institute of Environmental Sciences at Leiden University is that we should make better use of nature to, on the one hand, attain the Sustainable Development Goals, and at the same time making sure that we can protect nature. So with that respect, sort of a key question is how can we achieve kind of a positive role for these ecosystem services to make this transition to a sustainability. So basically the question is, how can we make sure that these arrows, which are either horizontal or going downwards, are all pointing upwards in order to indeed make sure that we can achieve our Sustainable Development Goals while protecting nature at the same time. And the way we think about it is shown in this particular graph. So what we are looking forward to is to think about landscapes. So we design landscapes or engineer landscapes that make sure that we promote ecosystem services. And by promoting those ecosystem services, we also hope to increase our human well-being. For instance, the fact that people enjoy going to a park that gives them a natural value, and therefore they are more happy than without being in that park. And then the question is, what are the best designs that allow us to maximize those services such that indeed we can attain maximum human well-being and hopefully also attain the Sustainable Development Goals. Of course, that's quite a complex kind of system, and for today I would like to focus basically on two questions of this. The first question is, how should we design indicators of those services that are indeed something that can be used by decision makers? So which indicators should we give decision makers such that they know the services are okay and indeed nature is protected and nature provides a positive impetus to this human well-being. And the second question is more from a data point of view. If those indicators are available, are they also available at the right resolution in order to really inform decision makers? Because many decision makers do want to make a decision for a particular river, a particular street, a particular park. And in order to do so, you need to have high resolution data to really inform locally what is going on. Or to put it differently, to make a true implementation, you need to have local information of high quality in order to truly inform decision making and not some kind of general theory which looks nice but can't be implemented. So those are kind of the two questions that in the remainder of this presentation I would like to focus upon. First, some good news. The decision makers are increasingly aware of the concept of ecosystem services. So this is a inventory that we made among various decision makers, and we asked decision makers, well, whether they could mention a number of ecosystem services that are connected to, well, the so-called sand engine, which is the picture on the right-hand side, which is a construction at the coast of the Netherlands, which was created to protect our coast against floods, but at the same time, it was also meant to improve some other aspects. So stimulate natural dew formation, stimulate recreation, stimulate nursery functions of the estuarine environment. And we were interested to know whether decision makers were aware of those additional things that were provided by this nature-based solution, in addition to flood protection alone. And indeed, interestingly, although of course everyone was talking about the coastal protection, they were also talking about all kinds of other things that are related to ecosystem services and nature protection. And some of them were even explicitly mentioning ecosystem services as a concept. So that shows that decision makers are increasingly aware of ecosystem services, and this does not only apply at a local or a national level, but similar kind of inventories have been done at the EU level, and also there decision makers are indeed aware of ecosystem services as a concept. And also thanks to the IPBES reports that I just introduced, that really increase the awareness across decision makers across the globe. However, being aware does not necessarily lead to adoption, because it should also fit the language of the decision makers. And if we are talking in academic terms, it does not connect to kind of the problems and the issues that decision makers have. So therefore, I don't think we should talk about carbon sequestration, but we should talk about how can we capture carbon to mitigate our climate, or how can we capture climate to fulfill our goals for the Paris Agreement on climate, because that is something, an obligation. So in that case, you directly translate it into something that makes sense to a decision maker. Likewise, I don't think we should talk about water regulation, but talking about how can we make sure that we have enough water in summer to irrigate our crops, because of climate change, drought is increasing in summer in Europe, and we need to store water for a longer period of time in order to make sure that we have enough water for our cities and our agriculture. And likewise, I don't think we should talk about cultural services, but we should talk about how can we stimulate people enjoying themselves in the parks, which is basically kind of similar to the picture I showed that of last spring in the city parks of Amsterdam. So if we frame ecosystem services in these contexts, then it may directly appeal to the decision makers and facilitate the adoption. And this is also something that we did for the water boards, and the names are in Dutch because it was meant for the Dutch water boards. But this is one way in which we try to, just as a visualization of the various ecosystem services that are provided by water and regions close to the water, as a way to stimulate the water boards, which in the Netherlands take care of water quality and water quality in the landscape, to make them aware of all the other things that their water management does to nature and through nature on human well-being. For instance, providing swimming water, allowing fisheries to take place, stimulating peat formation, etc., etc. And by visualizing this for them, we created awareness that, in fact, they do much more than just water alone. And by creating that awareness, we can also stimulate measures that take the whole shoot of ecosystem services related to water into account. And they are very interested now in order to do so. And just making such a visualization really helps them to create this awareness and then subsequently adopt the various measures and implement them in their landscape management. One way we did so is, well, trying to make calculations of those various ecosystem services in particular regions of the water boards. So what we do see here is a so-called polder, so a closed part of low-lying land in the Netherlands, surrounded by dikes. And originally, as you can see here in the top left, it was mostly agricultural meadows, so used for dairy farming. However, because of the extension of the cities nearby, there was a need for a water retention basin, because we wanted to avoid that the city nearby was flooded during spring when there's a lot of snow melt coming from the Alps to the Netherlands, which would cause some floods. So there was a need for a water retention basin. And then together with the water boards, we designed a water retention basin, as you can see here in the bottom left. So things have become much more watery, but we also have been trying to indicate to them that if they create a water retention basin, they may also allow creating other services like recreation, irrigation water for the nearby agriculture, which is still around at the other side of the dikes, etc. So what we did is we coupled the design to a hydrology model and a land use model, and by coupling this, we could also calculate if they indeed would make it a retention basin, what does happen to the standing water? So where do we create, for instance, habitats that could be interesting for waterfowl? How much does the groundwater increase? As you can see in the bottom right, which helps to indeed retain water, but also provides irrigation water for the agriculture nearby. And in our land use design, we made sure that we created kind of, well, surrounding greens around the water body for recreation. And by allowing the quantification of those various ecosystem services in the design, the water boards were also able to sell the concept to the stakeholders to the farmers, to the city nearby, because of course farmers would lose their land and they would be compensated for that. But at the same time, it was also clear for everyone in the surrounding that it could actually help their own well-being, because suddenly there was more water for irrigation nearby, there was more ideas with respect to recreation. So it is something that they were indeed enjoying. So by quantifying for these decision makers of the water boards the various ecosystem services, they could use this quantification to gain support for their own management and subsequently implement this management. And that is indeed what happened, because based on this analysis and of course all kinds of other consultations, this was indeed the design that was implemented last year. So, which is good for nature, because there's an increase in habitat, particularly for waterfowl and wet vegetation, at the cost of intensive farming, and it's good for human well-being as well. And that these are kind of the solutions that we really would like to find by making use of the concept of ecosystem services. And this is one example in which we can sort of try to summarize those findings for decision makers such that they know what they should take into account. And in this case, of course, it is very clear that agriculture is going down. So they will think about the opposition by farmers. And indeed, of course, that's what happened. But that was known in advance. So therefore budgeted and they were compensated. So in the end, they were kind of happy. And at the same time, there were all kinds of positive influences on a whole array of ecosystem services that really helped convincing various stakeholders that this was a good idea. And we apply similar things in other projects. So this is an example from what we call the Green Heart, which is a green area between the major cities of the Netherlands, used for intensive dairy farming. However, because of the intensive dairy farming, the groundwater levels have to be taken low, and because of all peatlands, the peatland is shrinking, and therefore we have a huge problem of soil subsidence. And they anticipate that this whole peat meadow environment will disappear in the next 20, 30 years and be turned into lakes if we don't do anything else. So there are multiple initiatives to go to a much more sustainable land management. And this is one example thereof, in which there's a corporation of cheese makers who want to use nature-based agricultural farming with flower-rich meadows and stimulating birds for breeding, and at the same time making sort of high-quality cheese with which they earn all kinds of prices. They can put it up higher up in the market, so you still have a business model, and at the same time much more nature-rich meadows. So also in this way, they are moving towards a sustainable landscape and improving nature at the same time. Another project is coming from our horticulture center. The guy on this picture is Ted Duivenstein. He is the director of the biggest tomato farm in the Netherlands. He has 25 hectares of tomatoes, but he's a very sustainable person. So as you can see, he has solar panels for his glass houses, so he creates energy. He has a carbon neutral greenhouses. It's all organically farmed. He uses natural pollinators, as well as he wants now also making his water use circular. So he has asked us and the Technical University of Delft to come up with a plan for him to also have a water neutral business. And we help him thinking about the ecosystem services, connecting that to the nature reserves that are next doors. So how can water use and water supply to nature be promoted, and at the same time promoting a circular water use for this tomato breeding. And he is very interested in developing a new business model that also is based on this not only carbon neutral, but also water neutral breeding. Just as a final example, so for some of the stakeholders and particularly provinces and municipalities in the region, we are running scenarios to show them what is going to happen with a number of ecosystem services if they do a different management. So, for instance, here, this is another polder in low-lying Netherlands, and here you can see a measure of the carbon sequestration, so how much carbon is available in the soil. And as you can, maybe you can see it, I hope that your resolution is high enough, but there's a small purple patch in here in an otherwise brown landscape. In this purple patch, there's much more carbon sequestration currently than anywhere else. And this turns out to be a farm who has switched from intensive dairy farming to something that is called paludiculture, which is making use of wet vegetation to make a farm. So in this case, this person is not growing grass, but he's growing cranberries, and which is sort of an upmarket product for the food industry. And he sells the cranberries at a good price, but because cranberries can grow at a much higher groundwater level, you stimulate peat formation and therefore you stimulate carbon sequestration. Just as a thought experiment, we run our models to evaluate how much carbon sequestration would you get if half of the polder would start growing cranberries. And indeed, you see on the right-hand side, things are turning much more purple than before, indicating that carbon sequestration is increased. And in addition to carbon sequestration, also all kinds of other ecosystem services go up. So if indeed it would be possible to make a business model for the region based on cranberries, it would help the region avoiding soil subsidence and stimulating all kinds of other ecosystem services, as well as, re-stimulating peat formation and all the various natural processes that are coinciding with those. And increasingly, we make use of high-resolution data for those. And this is just an example showing the spatial resolution of different satellites and kind of how many spectral bands they have. And increasingly, we have a number of satellites available that gives us information at the 1 to 10 meter resolution. So very high resolution data that we can immediately use for our quantification of the ecosystem services. If we want to do so, and if we are wanting to think about good indicators, we need to take a number of things into account. So our indicators of ecosystem services should be credible. So people should understand what they are and they should be able to trust them. They should be legitimate and they should be salient. So something that you can quantify, something that is scalable, something that is transparent. And at the same time, it should be feasible. So we are currently working on a number of systems in which we take these criteria into account to see what kind of satellite products can we make that fulfill those criteria and therefore they are directly useful for our decision makers. An example. So this is the city of The Hague, where our government resides. And thanks to high resolution satellite measurements, we could measure the temperature in summer inside the city of The Hague at a neighborhood level. So we could see that some neighborhoods clearly have a higher temperature than surrounding neighborhoods. And this is called the heat island effect. And it is occurring across all cities across the globe, including Jakarta, Jogja, etc., etc. because cities kind of contain the heat from the sun because they have less opportunity to cool, because there's less vegetation, less transpiration, there's less wind because of the high buildings, and therefore temperatures are rising. And as you can see, sort of the temperature that is rising compared to kind of the background signal is, well, a couple of degrees, 5 to 6 degrees higher in cities than in the surrounding areas, which causes, well, health problems to many of our city population, not only in the Netherlands, but throughout the globe. And here we evaluated whether the occurrence of heat in those neighborhoods was connected to having a green infrastructure. So at the bottom, you can see the various green infrastructures or lack of green infrastructures in those neighborhoods. And indeed, if you do have some kind of green parks or city forests, the temperature was lower by 1 to 2 degrees than in the surrounding areas. And this is something that the municipality of The Hague, which was kind of the commissioner of this research, was really interested at, because we could provide proof that indeed stimulating parks helps to reduce the heat island effect, which will increase the health of the population and therefore also the cost of medical care in the city. And this is one way in which indeed we provide proof for well, an increase of green infrastructure in cities using high-resolution satellite data. And similar things we have been doing for Amsterdam. So here you can see sort of the city of Amsterdam at different resolutions. And then it's also clear that if you go from, well, a relatively high, but still, well, not as good as 10 meters resolution, you get a different map than if you truly are going to use the high resolution data coming from satellites. So you get much more information from satellite information if we are really using high resolution data. So now also the city of Amsterdam has become very interested in using this high resolution data in order to, well, understand the cooling provided by green infrastructure and see how, and particularly where, they should stimulate it first. So, for instance, going back to the example of The Hague, it was quite clear that some neighborhoods really had major problems with the heat. And now the municipality of The Hague is considering for those specific neighborhoods how they can plant additional trees or how they could provide extra green in specifically those neighborhoods. So it directly translates indeed into decision making. And also, we increasingly use citizen science to inform our decision makers. So this is one example on the left-hand side. Our Institute of Astronomy in Leiden University developed an app called iSpecs. You could put that on your iPhone, and with that app on the iPhone, you can measure fine dust in the environment. And those fine dust measurements, if tens of thousands of citizens do that, provide a much more detailed map than a satellite map of the same kind of property. So this shows that citizen information is really important to inform our decision makers for particular ecosystem services or health issues. And the same kind of we do for biodiversity. So we use citizen science. People can upload their observations, for instance, for bees, and with that we can make maps of bee populations in the province. We use artificial intelligence technologies to allow citizens to determine the species names of the bees. So they can upload a picture of the bee, and then by artificial intelligence, using a reference library, they will come up with a prospective name for that bee species in order to increase the quality of the determination of the bee species. And this is a great thing if then coupled to databases, because then you directly have a complete overview of, in this case, the various bees in the surroundings. Given that bees are important pollinators, we can then try to come up with so-called landscapes for bees in the municipalities, creating flower-rich boundaries, flower-rich sidewalks, etc., to stimulate the bees, and which is something the municipalities really like seeing. And they see it works because they can directly check on the app whether indeed citizens do find more bee species. So this is one way to stimulate in both directions, informing decision makers, but also evaluating decision making and therefore stimulating further progress in that direction. Before I go to the conclusions, I would like to once more go to the Mentimeter with you for a final question to you. Which is something on the usefulness of ecosystem services. So I'm curious that either based on this presentation or because you had other ideas already before the presentation, whether you agree with these various statements. So my first statement is that co-designing ecosystem services together with decision makers helps the adoption of this concept into policy. And I ask you to whether you agree or disagree with this, whether we do need better data before we can actually use ecosystem services, as well as whether we should involve citizens in the management of our landscape or not, or whether we should leave it to the professionals, because also, of course, that is something that you could consider. And I'm curious about your opinions on this. All right, it seems that the majority is thinking that indeed we should involve citizens. And that's interesting, I think, because indeed citizen science is increasingly considered to be important. And at the same time, we don't know well enough how to best involve citizens in our management as well as in our science. And this is a field that is developing fairly quickly. Also at Leiden University, there's some people really active in thinking about how can we best develop citizen science such that it truly informs both science and policy making. So this is an active field of research. At the same time, you are all considering that we should have better data. So that really indicates that indeed the various systems based on satellite information, citizen science data information, other databases should be developed further in order to make sure that we can use ecosystem services. And this is indeed also something that not only we, and I showed you some examples from the way the work we do, but also across Europe, but also by NASA in the United States, people are considering what they can do with respect to satellite information to inform policy making and decision making. And finally, it seems that indeed you think that co-designing with the decision makers is a good idea. At the same time, you also have some reservations, it seems. So it seems that you consider that although involving decision makers in the assessment of ecosystem services is a bit of a good idea, but we should not. We should also have some independence of science, it seems, if I interpret this course properly. So thank you for that. I would like to go to my conclusions. So, to my point of view, I think we indeed need to take better care of nature and its ecosystem services. We are thinking that we need to co-design our ecosystem services assessments together with the decision makers to make sure that we create products that are actually useful for them. So that is what I gave you some examples of. We increasingly use high-resolution satellite data and citizen science information to really get information at the local scales that most of our decision makers need. And through this, we hope to make a contribution through science to indeed create a sustainable society. And with that, I would like to thank you. And if afterwards you would like to contact me, this is my email address. Terima kasih.
Thank you very much, Peter, for this very interesting lecture. As a novice in this field, it provided me a kind of look behind the scenes, what ecosystem transformation is all about. I saw that in your presentation. My impression is that there are actually two sides of the job. One is the more technical aspects of compiling data, providing scenarios, coming up with solutions for transformation of a circular ecosystem. And the other one is actually more political, how to create awareness for the decision makers, how to make sure that they get the right data and can make the right decisions. So it's not only a technical but also a very social and human approach to this aspect of circular and sustainable ecosystems. Let me check whether we have, because we'll check if there are any questions, and there are some questions. Let me start with the first one. How can we integrate between social and natural sciences in such research? What is your experience with this type of collaboration? So I guess it's the same, like I mentioned before. It's not only the natural aspects but also the social aspects in research. And what is your personal experience with this type of collaboration?
Well, it is important, and to my point of view, if we are wanting to make a contribution to society, we need to have this interdisciplinary or even transdisciplinary type of approaches. So transdisciplinary also involving the stakeholder, the co-design, co-creation kind of things I mentioned before. So I think it's essential, to my point of view, to go interdisciplinary, and at the same time, it's not easy. So over the past 3 to 4 years, we have been collaborating very intensively with our colleagues from the Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs, where there is a new professor working on governance or sustainability aspects, as well as our Faculty of Social Sciences, where from an anthropology point of view, people are increasingly interested in the values of people with respect to sustainability. So how does society think about sustainability? And increasingly we collaborate in framing our research. At the same time, I think we spent the first 2 years to try to understand each other's language. So you need to have a long period of time and really have the drive together to make it work. And we all have the drive to make it work because we want to make an impact on society. And now we are indeed working together for a couple of years. And I think we increasingly understand each other and increasingly understand the challenges of the different disciplines, and therefore really can come up with this integral kind of thinking. but it takes a long while.
Thank you. Yes, I can imagine that creating awareness and influencing is something that doesn't happen overnight, and also you have to maybe at some point show a proven track record of things that worked to also convince people with successes, and you mentioned some of them in your presentation. I have another question from Dimas. In the Netherlands, are all of the high-resolution satellite data accessible by everyone?
Yes and no. So the default satellite, high-resolution satellite data are called the Sentinels. Those are the satellites from the European Space Agency, and that implies that the European Space Agency makes all those data freely available, open accessible. At the same time, you need to know what you're doing before you can use any of those data, because the European Space Agency just provides the raw measurements coming from the satellite, and then it's up to the researcher to make any sense out of those. So you need to work together with remote sensing experts and satellite experts in order to turn that into products. And that's something we indeed do. And we have some people working with us that turn those into products. So if you don't have that expertise in the house, then there's an alternative which is called the Copernicus Services. So the Copernicus Services are the platform from the European Union where you can download products for free from products made from the Sentinel data. Of course, that is more limited and mostly limited to, let's say, land cover and LAI, so the thickness of the vegetation, so to speak. If you want to have additional ones, then you need to develop your own product. So yes, it is freely available, and not only in Europe, but sort of also you could download it yourself if you go to the ESA hub, if you have a fast enough computer. But you need to know what you're doing in order to make sense out of it.
Thank you, Peter. In terms of satellite data, is this available in Leiden itself, or this is part of the cooperation with Delft University?
No, it's available in Leiden itself. So we use our own supercomputers to download the data because high resolution data is fantastic. But you may imagine that if you have 10-meter resolution data for multiple wavelengths every 5 days across the globe, it quickly becomes a big file. So we use our supercomputers to download the data and to compile useful products out of those.
Thank you. I mentioned in your introduction that you're also involved in the MC program in Leiden, and also training students to get to become also involved in this type of collaboration and research. And there's a question from, let me see, I don't have the name. There we go. There's a question: how can I, as a lecturer, encourage students who are already aware of the current situation in the environment, but how also to nurture activism in them? So how can students become agents of change? Is this something that you also include in your MSc program?
Yes, certainly we do that. So in our MSc program, most of the students selecting this particular program are activists, kind of. They are really motivated to make a change. So what we currently do in our MC program is to provide them basically with skills and knowledge to make this activism useful for to truly make a change. So in our MSc program, we collaborate with there's a joint program with the Faculty of Global Governance and Global Affairs, and so they from that faculty they get insights in how does governance work, how should you influence governance, how could you do a stakeholder analysis, what are network analysis, how does the policy cycle work. So we really provide them with information on how to govern. And at the same time, we provide them with the natural sciences background. So how does climate change work? How does biodiversity work? How should we assess water quality? So we provide them with a mixture of natural sciences information to understand how sustainability works, and simultaneously providing them with knowledge on the governance processes, and we couple that with various skills. So they need to make their own stakeholder analysis. They need to talk with stakeholders. They need to get research questions by talking to stakeholders. So we involve municipalities and provinces and water boards in our program. And they're also very interested to be involved because these are the kind of students that really can help them to solve their issues. So they are very interested in being involved in our program.
Thank you. Thank you. So it's not a standalone program. It's actually already integrated with future stakeholders who might need their services of the students. Yeah. And a question from Albertus. The government of Indonesia is integrating SDG achievement into the preparation of development plans. So sustainability is being mainstreamed into development programs in Indonesia. What is the experience in the Netherlands in particular, or Europe in general, in terms of integrating SDG achievements in development plans?
Yeah, that's a good but difficult question to answer. I think at all different levels, people are aware of the SDGs and the importance of the SDGs. At the same time, from my own personal understanding, I think it is less explicit in many things that we do in the Netherlands than, for instance, in Indonesia or some of the other non-European countries. At the same time, at the EU level, there is currently a whole discussion on the so-called Green Deal. And the SDGs are a central component of the new Green Deal. So the Green Deal was developed by the EU Commission in order to stimulate sustainability, a very ambitious program with a lot of money involved. And that is the first instance that I think really at a large scale, they are considering explicitly SDG achievements in their planning and sort of in combination with natural capital accounting, turning to a circular economy, turning into sustainable agriculture within Europe. So it's a very ambitious program for the SDGs. But to be honest, I think over the past years, before the Green Deal, I think the ambitions in our country, in the Netherlands and in Europe, were not as well pronounced as in some other countries.
Thank you. I agree. I had the same impression, actually. We also talked about citizen science, which is a kind of new approach to collect data. And you mentioned that Leiden is also thinking about how to involve more citizens in data collection. I know there are pros and cons. I mean, you get data from data which you might ordinarily not get. On the other hand, there's also some controversy about whether the data can be trusted. Is it corrupted? Yes or no? And the question is how to increase the participation of the community in citizen science.
I think you increase the participation if they think they can really make a contribution. So either because they have an interest in the topic. So, for instance, our colleagues at astronomy are making use of citizen science to kind of hunt new galaxies. So they provide pictures coming from the satellites like Hubble and then people are just invited to try to find new galaxies, and then if they find one, they upload it to the astronomy institute, and then they check. So, which is a great way of using citizen science. But then from the internal motivation of a person to understand astronomy and being involved in astronomy, and likewise, this is also, for instance, for biodiversity, an internal drive. Many people are interested in nature, want to understand nature better, and by allowing them to be involved in biodiversity research, they get stimulated themselves and motivated to collect the data. So that is one way in which you can do it, and in order to do so, it is important not to demotivate them fairly quickly. So if you would come sort of, okay, this is the flora, and this is the determination key, good luck, then many of them will not join. However, if you provide them with apps in which they can upload their pictures, and then they get the answer, oh, this is the species name, it motivates, because they learn fairly quickly without needing the technical details. So you need to facilitate in an app environment or other data science environments, you need to stimulate their participation. The other way in which you can stimulate the participation, if people have a concern, and for instance, with the Fine Dust app example that I showed you before, many people in the Netherlands, and I'm sure the same thing applies to the big cities in Indonesia, are concerned with all the fine dust coming from traffic and elsewhere. And they want to know whether they are at risk for their own health. And then a citizen science can sort of pick onto that feeling of insecurity, and then provide them with a way to get involved, and therefore people feel more in control, and they are more in control because they provide data for better policies. So in that case, you stimulate sort of the fact there is a concern, and they can use that concern to try to make a change. So to my point of view, those are ways in which you can stimulate it.
Thank you. Also, from your example, sometimes it shows that if you want to transform an ecosystem, there's always some controversy. There should be a balance between the economic value versus the value of nature. So in terms of prioritizing, there's a question from Louise. How can we prioritize economic interest, or how can we prioritize between economic interest and sustainable land use management? And for instance, in Jambi, sometimes forest areas are used because of the economical needs and for the community life. But then if the forest is depleted, then it will become less sustainable. So how can you balance between the economic interest and the sustainable land use interest?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think that there's a number of answers to that. So first of all, sometimes there is a difference between your short-term economic gains versus your long-term economic gains. So I think that's important to make clear whether indeed there's a long-term economic gain for a particular transformation. The other one is, in our economy, we have been externalizing many of our costs for a long period of time. So to clarify this, for a long period of time, we simply did not include the costs of our impact on the environment in the prices of our products. And because they are not incorporated in the price of our products, some of our products are simply too cheap. And some unsustainable products should be much more expensive if they really take into account the cleaning of the environment that is caused by the production of those costs. So that is sometimes called the true pricing mechanism, and there's a lot of research ongoing, not in our institutes, but in other international universities on true pricing mechanisms. The third one is to think about, can we come up with new business models that are really sustainable? And that's kind of the way we are approaching things currently. So, for instance, in the examples of this cheese making, they get a higher price for their products. That's of course useful for them directly, but also they get money from the water board because in their regions the groundwater levels are higher, and because the groundwater levels are higher, source subsidence is less of a problem, and therefore the water board needs to drain less, and which is sort of an avoided cost of the water board. We could quantify this avoided cost of the water board, and now the water board is making the payments similar to the avoided cost to the cheese making. So they pay for water. And likewise, there is also CO2 credit systems. So people are considering whether if you sequester carbon or if you're carbon neutral, in fact, you should be paid by a CO2 crediting system in order to, show that indeed you provide that additional product, which is CO2 credits. So there are all kinds of additional business models in place currently that would help more of those sustainable products. Maybe as one final example, one of our big banks was originally a corporational bank for farmers. It still is a corporational bank. And they are now collaborating with us and the Natural History Museum. And they give a discount on the mortgage of farmers if the farmers provide sustainable agriculture. So you don't see it in the price, but it's still a benefit for the farmers. So if the farmers take particular measures and we can measure that the impact of those measures with our tools, then there's a discount on the mortgage. So those are alternative ways of stimulating these ideas, but we still need to develop most of those, and we need to develop those together to really make a change.
And I also can imagine that every situation requires a different approach in how to make sure that all involved know about the benefits that they can have in terms to make a decision between the economic impact and the sustainable impact.
Certainly.
Let me check. That was another question from Nurul Vinarni. Can we include culture in co-designing ecosystem services? Just looking at the situation in Indonesia, where you have many ethnic groups who may have different perceptions on ecosystem services, and are these kind of cultural aspects also included when you when you co-design a ecosystem service?
Yes, it's very important, and indeed, fortunately, there's an increasing understanding and an increasing awareness on these. So in the global assessment of the IPBES report that I mentioned in my presentation, the indigenous knowledge and indigenous understanding of the ecosystem services is a very central theme. So I would recommend having a look at the global assessments of the IPBES to have an impression of how indigenous knowledge is indeed incorporated. And it is central to create acceptance, but also to make sure that we do the right decisions.
Yeah, I agree, because in all things that is provided as a tool to move towards a sustainable ecosystem, you need the acceptance of the local community. Otherwise, it would be too much top-down and it would not be accepted. Then, in terms of ecosystems, there are many different types of ecosystems, and which ones actually are urgently in need to use new technologies? Which type of ecosystems are in urgent need to use new technologies, and how is it applicable in different ecosystems? If I see the question right, I think because there are many ecosystems, which ecosystems are actually have to be prioritized in the future?
Oh, that's a difficult question, and I think you can answer that from many different directions. So of course you could answer it from sort of which our ecosystems are most under threat. And again, this IPBES global assessment gives you a perfect overview of rankings ecosystems based on sort of the global threats. You could also approach it from kind of what is locally needed. For instance, in an Indonesian context, it is, I think, very important to reconsider mangrove ecosystems as a way to protect the coast and to, well, everything connected to coast protection, nurseries, fisheries, etc. But then you approach it more from a ecosystem services point of view, being flood protection and fisheries, than sort of biodiversity, because of course, well, mangroves are less diverse in species numbers than tropical forests. So I think it is a question that's hard to answer and really depends on how you approach things.
Right. Yeah, thank you very much. We have actually come to the end of this very interesting webinar. I would like to thank Peter for providing the information, so we have a more insight in what the department in Leiden University is doing, and also the examples of typical projects that have been carried out. I would like to also thank all the participants for the questions, and I will give the floor back to Sweta. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Terima kasih Pak Marik untuk acaranya hari ini. Thank you everybody for joining, participating in this webinar. Please check the chat box because we've already sent some information about Professor Pran Bodegom's institutes and also his affiliation in Leiden University. Should you are interested about the topic and about and if you have research in the same topics, please feel free to contact us. And also we have put the Google link for the survey feedback for the event. Please fill in the survey as we will choose 3 participants who will get some year-end prizes from the Office of Leiden University in Indonesia. Terima kasih sudah bergabung di acara di sore ini dan semoga tahun 2020 ini diakhiri dengan rasa bahagia dan tahun 2021 kita akan menyambutnya dengan optimis karena vaksin akhirnya telah tiba. Terima kasih semuanya, selamat sore dan selamat menikmati libur akhir tahun ini.
Okay, thank you very much also to all of you. Have a good new year and hopefully a better 2021.